Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to welcome you here. I have been at the Wheatley Institution for about a year, have had the opportunity to welcome a number of visitors, but I am extremely happy, even a little bit proud of Wheatley for having Professor Katherine Marshall here today. Look out into the smiling faces of the students, some here of your own free will, some of here under some modicum of duress. But you are the reason that we're here. A number of us sat on your side of the mic, so to speak, a few decades ago, and the options for us who were interested in international affairs are pretty limited. State Department, CIA, Pentagon, Chase Manhattan Bank, and a few others. But the world has changed, and the opportunities for you have multiplied so vastly. And the idea that, as we were discussing as we walked over, that you don't really have to compartmentalize your life in a way that leaves your faith out of the picture as you contemplate and pursue your future, as you find a way to make a contribution in the world. That's what I'm really excited about, is that some of that vision now can open up to you. We are going to kind of work in two segments. Professor Marshall will give a presentation and entertain some Q&A, and we'll plan to bring that to a close at about 10 to 5, thinking of this as kind of a regular class period. But we know there are a couple of classes, one in poli-sci and one in development, who are here, and we will then invite those of you who are here, as I say, under some duress, come forward, and then we'll have an extended Q&A with those students until up to 5:30 or until the questions run out. So that's the format we'll work under. By way of formal introduction, Katherine Marshall has worked for 4 decades in international development with a focus on issues facing the world's poorest countries and populations. She is currently a senior fellow at Georgetown University's Berkley Center and a visiting professor in the School of Foreign Service, where she enjoys the gift, as we do here, of working with the next generation. Before coming to Georgetown, Professor Marshall worked for 35 years at the World Bank. Among her many assignments, she was country director in the bank's Africa division, first for the Sahel region and then for Southern Africa. Before that, she was country division chief in Latin America and agriculture in Eastern Africa. She led the bank's work on social policy and governance during the East Asia crisis years. From 2000 to 2006, she was counselor to the bank's president on ethics, values, and faith in development. Again, that might be a bit of a wake-up call for you to realize that 15 years ago, the World Bank already had begun to organize itself to the idea that faith has a role in development. Professor Marshall was involved from the beginning in the creation and growth of the World Faiths Development Dialogue and is its executive director. She serves on 2 international prize committees, the Opus Prize Foundation and the Nwanu Peace Prize Foundation, and chairs the board of the World Bank Community Connections Fund. I'll mention one more item along these lines. She was a core member of the World Economic Forum's initiative to advance understanding between the Islamic world and the West. She writes on wide-ranging development and humanitarian topics and contributes regularly, and I would encourage you to subscribe to her posts on the Huffington Post, the religion page. Her 2 most recent books are Global Institutions of Religion, Ancient Movers, Modern Shakers, and The World Bank, From Reconstruction to Development to Equity. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd please join me in welcoming Professor Katherine Marshall.
Where's it there? Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming. This is my first visit to Brigham Young University, and it's been a wonderful welcome, and I feel that I have learned an extraordinary amount in the few short hours that I have been here. I'm going to talk, I hope, for about 20, 25 minutes. If I go beyond that, will somebody please give me a bird or something, because I do want to be sure that there's time for questions. And sometimes I get carried away with stories and go off point despite the PowerPoint. But basically, when you've looked at the news, when you think about what's happened over the last few months, I don't think there's ever been a time when religion has been on the front page and in the headlines as much as it has in the last few months. Obviously, we're all of us horrified, but also puzzled by the seemingly sudden emergence of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Before that, I think one of the most horrific stories that we've heard for a long time has been the sudden outburst of Christian-Muslim tensions and horrible deaths in the Central African Republic. We're focused very much on the extraordinary kidnapping of girls in Nigeria. And it was not very long ago, just a week or two ago, that I was in a meeting with a lot of Nigerians who were saying that there were thousands of girls who had been kidnapped before that, many of them Muslim. And it was not until you had this very large group of Christian girls that the social media and the media suddenly woke up. The rise of homophobia in various African countries, notably in Uganda, has really represented a crisis. And again, as with all of these, forces us to think about what's happening. The threat to Christians in the Middle East is really very frightening. But there's also something no one expected, which is Buddhist-Muslim tensions and violence in various parts of Asia, particularly Sri Lanka and Myanmar. These all raise questions of human rights. I'm personally involved because I'm organizing a meeting on Monday in the Ebola crisis in 3 countries of West Africa. And again, raising the question of where is the religious dimension of this crisis? Clearly, it is the people who are at the forefront, the health workers who are caring for people and dying, but it is also the potential of the networks of religious leaders to respond. So these are clearly issues. Global engagement is the title we gave to this presentation. Faith is everywhere, interwoven with politics, with society, with demography, with urbanization, and so forth. I want to emphasize, because so many of these headlines are negative, the extraordinary positive side that we see in the picture of faith. The work for peace, Desmond Tutu is just one example. Social justice, Martin Luther King. The really remarkable work of nuns particularly, but many other figures who are inspired by their religion for health and for education. The role that many religious communities are playing to protect the environment, and the ancient traditions of charity and care for the poor and the vulnerable. But we do face, and this is again a preoccupation that we've seen this year more than almost anywhere else, is conveyed in this picture very vividly. Does anyone know where this picture comes from? Has anyone seen it? Yeah, it's Sao Paulo. But the extraordinary juxtaposition of wealth and poverty is something that we see sometimes as vividly as here, but often, and being here in Provo, you're not as acutely aware of the inequalities of our world as people who live in other parts of the world are. So why focus on this twinning of religion and development? Partly it is because they are so deeply intertwined, and that's really the topic that we'll be talking about today. I also want to emphasize that in the countries which are a major area of focus for us today, and which I'm sure you're focusing on in your classes, what we call now the fragile and conflict states, or the poorly performing states. Some people call them the failed states, etc. In those countries, religion is even more important than it is in other places. And by religion, I mean religious institutions as well as beliefs and the roles of leaders. However, and this is again our topic here, these dimensions were largely ignored in many circles. Madeleine Albright, after she left her position as Secretary of State, wrote a book called The Mighty and the Almighty. But it is essentially saying, had I thought more or known more, had more professional advice about religion, I would have handled a lot of world affairs in quite different ways. So the fact is that it has been ignored. One of my symbols is that in the World Bank Library, there was no category for religion or theology or faith. And I pointed it out many times, and as far as I know, there still is no category. So there is a new focus, and we're seeing it in many places within the UN system, within bilateral agencies. The Norwegians, the Swedes, the Danes are all doing studies about religion and development, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Swiss. But I'm afraid that it's quite often fairly superficial, it's quite biased, and it's often ephemeral. In other words, as soon as the leader moves on, somebody comes in with a new objective. So my goal, and this is the bottom line of what I'm talking about and what I'm working for, is to see religion as an integral facet of foreign policy and development work. And the issue is not what you believe anywhere near as much as it is what do the people you work with believe. And we should not forget that some 85% of the world's people, this is a Pew study, belong to one or another religious community, that it's a major force in their lives. And if our objective is to help them, we need to see that side of it. And ultimately, what this will result in is a better quality of work for development. And that's as true in a local community as it is in some place very far away. So that's really what we're talking about. So what I'm planning to do is to speak briefly about my journey through the personal life, so you have some sense of, as we call it, where I'm coming from. Secondly, the effort by the president of the World Bank and the Archbishop of Canterbury to introduce these subjects seemed like something relatively bland, but it unleashed a firestorm of controversy. And it was a serious controversy because the World Bank has 184 member countries, or it did at the time, has a few more now. And Wolfenson was often proud of saying that the effort on religion was 184 to 0 against, which was a slight exaggeration, but the fact is that it ran into a firestorm of opposition, and we learned a great deal from trying to understand where the opposition came from. In many ways, the ways in which religion has been part of the development agenda is part of the history of development. And so I have a very quick tour through some of the major phases of thinking about development and where these issues of faith and religious institutions, religious beliefs, and leaders come into it. We've been doing a lot of work at Georgetown and at the World Faiths Development Dialogue, a lot of research. And I have a few points emerging from the research that we can talk about here and we can talk about later as well. But to give you a hint, they are, first of all, the basic issues of governance and power. In other words, the links with politics. Secondly, coordination, because a lot of religious organizations are not part of one of the major issues in development now, which is called aid harmonization or aid coordination. There are lots of concerns about proselytizing that come up when people talk about religion and development. In fact, it's often the second thing that people will mention when you say you should be taking this into account. And the first issue is gender, because within the development community, it's almost an article of faith that men and women are equal and that improving the status of women is the single most important change that you can make. And the vision of religious organizations is that they are against equality. equality for women, and particularly when you see photographs of religious leaders who don't include women, it detracts from the credibility of the effort. So it's a real issue for a lot of different reasons. And finally, if we have time, I'll talk a little bit about ways forward and some of the potential for partnerships and what Habitat for Humanity calls the theology of the hammer, which is basically working with building houses together or doing something practical together as a way of breaking down the barriers among religious traditions, and I would argue something even more difficult between the sort of religious perspectives and the non-religious or secular perspectives that have tended to dominate many of the institutions. So basically, when did the contemporary sort of rediscovery of religion occur? Karen Armstrong has a wonderful word that she uses for it. She calls it revelation, but she reminds us that revelation means removing the veil. So in other words, the religious beliefs and institutions and so forth were there all the time, but the question is, when did people start to see them? When did the veil removed? And the two markers that people point to often are 1979, which was the Iranian Revolution, and then the second was 9/11. And those are two markers that people go back to all the time. I referred to the World Bank experience. The World Bank is probably the least likely organization, from many people's perspectives, to venture into the complex territory of religion. Frankly, it was because of a leader, an individual leader, and I think there are important lessons there that people make a tremendous difference and that a leader can really do something. But our experience, which I became involved in 1999, of dealing with the opposition was an important marker and an important series of lessons. Another side of it, I never hesitate, particularly when I'm speaking to secular people, to remind them that religion is enormously complex, very dynamic, changing all the time, that any simplistic vision of what religion is about is going to get you into trouble. But I likewise need to remind people that development is also very complex and that it's also changing and that there are many different ways of looking at development. For any of you who have not lived through this history, I can recommend something called The Commanding Heights, which is a 6-hour video that was produced based on a book by Daniel Yergin, but it essentially is the history of economic thinking in the 20th century, and the ways in which the sort of right-wing, left-wing role of the state, role of economists, et cetera, is played out, is told in a remarkably effective way. I found it fascinating because I lived this, I was in the World Bank really for more than half its history, and was part of all these changes of Thatcher, Reagan, Carter, et cetera. But seeing this gave me a much better appreciation of what some of the forces behind were. The breadth of the links between religion and development are enormous. I often put out the challenge to present an issue to me and I will find a religious dimension. Just to give you an idea, we were asked by the United Nations Foundation to work on energy access. And I thought that at first that it would be impossible to find the religious link, but we found many. Among them, there are many, many faith-linked groups that work on clean cook stoves, on solar energy, for example, solar suitcases to hospitals so that women can deliver babies when they decide to come at night. But they also get involved in cases of the grid, of the complexities of pricing and subsidy policies, et cetera. So you have the Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals, culture, politics, environment, and of course many issues on security. And these issues vary by country, by religious tradition. So we're entering into an enormously complex area. I'm going to skip over this one. but this is essentially this cartoon by a South African cartoonist who, by the way, gets into trouble periodically because he goes pretty far. But essentially, for many people, religion is a minefield. And it is one of the reasons why people have hesitated so much to deal with the issues. These are two charts for anyone who's interested in them. I put them up as charts, not so that you have to read through them right now, but to give you an idea of the complexity of it. But this is, in a sense, the distillation of our discussions with 184 governments as to why they were hesitant to deal with the religious aspects. And it summarizes as 3 Ds and an E. So the 3 Ds are, first, that religion is seen as political and divisive, that religious groups fight each other. Their main objective is to recruit more people, that they foster intolerance. That's a very strong image that people hold of religion that we heard about constantly when we were talking to the representatives of 184 countries. Second D is that religion's seen as dangerous to progress, that it's patriarchal, that religious institutions don't want change, they don't want to see modernization, and nothing is more salient there that comes up more often than reproductive health rights and the roles of women. So those are issues that we heard again and again as we talked. And the third is that religion's basically defunct, that it's not important, it's not a priority, because with modernization it becomes less important. So why should we pay attention? Why should we care? A final issue which fascinated me, I was in one of the very first women doing the kind of work that I was doing, being a manager and a leader. And the first group of women, I think very admirably decided that we were not going to hide behind professionalism and say, I will do my job. We decided to advocate for women within the organization, but also for strategic approach to engaging women's issues more fully in thinking about development. But in those early years, it was fascinating to go to meetings about gender. And first of all, very few men would show up. But when there were mixed groups, people's voice tone changed because there was an emotional content to talking about gender that you didn't see on other issues. And it was because it's very personal. I mean, everyone faces questions within their family. They're asking these questions. And I found very much the same issue with religion, that it's very difficult to have an objective conversation about religious issues because for people, it's part of their soul, their heart, and emotions come into it. So, and that's also in hostility. There are some people where I raise these kinds of issues or would give a presentation like this, and they would simply turn off and turn away because they're not interested. So I want also to emphasize that many religious leaders, institutions, and actors have strong views about the development community. And there are 5 E's and a D, so I'll go very quickly through those. For many, they see the development enterprise as basically about empire, and particularly American empire. It's about American multinationals, it's about US power, and so there's an intrinsic suspicion. We're working in Senegal, and I was shocked that the religious leaders of the Sufi brotherhoods in Senegal view any talk about family health and maternal health as part of an American plot to limit the number of Muslims in the world. In other words, this is a very live and important issue. People are concerned that the development institutions tend to be mute about ethics. They don't talk about ethical issues, even though every single development issue raises profound questions about ethical choice. They are hostile to the effects of development, communities disrupted, families disrupted, etc. They're terrified of economics in many cases. They see economics as theology, and in fact, it's fascinating to hear people talk about economists economists preach. They're rigid, they're dogmatic, they don't listen. They believe in unseen forces, the hidden hand of the market, and so forth. And they see the institutions and the discipline as enigmatic. So the upshot is that development is dangerous. These are two images that sort of convey some of this hostility. The first one is Noah's Ark. It's actually an old Oliphant cartoon about obesity, but you may not be able to read it, but it's "Who let the Americans on board?" is basically the message. And the other is another image of inequality. I want to emphasize that there are countless synergistic and positive and constructive paths. The most important is that religious institutions and development institutions are the advocates for the world's poor and excluded. They care passionately about doing something for those who are left behind and marginalized. The religious institutions have an extraordinary reach and depth. They grapple with ethical issues and talk about them all the time. And the overlap goes from AIDS to zebras. From every development issue, there's a religious link. Another issue that I find fascinating, I don't know how many of you have heard serious speeches by people from the development world, but they're often excruciatingly boring and very serious. If you go into religious circles, very often you hear the extraordinary power of communication, the power of story. And increasingly we're seeing it with modern media, with social media. You really are dealing with people who have a skill to reach people, which we need desperately in the development world in order to awake people to what they can do and what they need to do. And the other issue that is important in looking at the religious institutions is their authenticity and their durability. It's not at all uncommon to hear a religious leader or community say, "We've been here before you were born and we'll be here long after you're dead." We're an authentic part of this community, whereas an NGO or a development institution comes in. I don't know how many of you have heard the phrase briefcase NGOs, which is a common word for the kinds of NGOs that are set up for a specific purpose. But one of the issues, and something we hear about a lot, is something that's called instrumentalizing. And if we had a little bit more time, I'd ask you to guess what that meant. But it essentially is a tendency of people in the development world, once they've sort of woken up to the size of these religious institutions, to say, let's use them to get people to wash their hands, or let's use them, I'll write your sermon for you. And needless to say, that generates resentment and it doesn't work. So to go very quickly through some of the phases of engagement, I think you can look at the international development effort as starting from World War II, basically right after World War II with the Bretton Woods meeting in 1944 and Truman, but increasingly through the 1950s. But through most of that period, there was virtually no explicit focus on religious dimensions at all. It was ignoring an unease. There was no training. There were no bibliographies. Some people wrote things. The research that was done was not reflected. There was no record of what was done, very little learning. There was then a period of intense criticism, and many of you may have heard about the Jubilee 2000 campaign on poor country debt, but there were also many campaigns on environment. The growing power of civil society caught the World Bank by surprise, and religious organizations were often part of it. So these criticisms really hurt the institutions and did lead over time to a rethinking of approaches and positions. There was also a study called The Voices of the Poor. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It was a study of 64,000 people in communities all over the world. And one of the surprising findings of this study was something that's been confirmed in many surveys afterwards, that if poor people were asked who they trusted the most, the most common answer was their religious leaders or their religious communities. So this issue of trust and the importance of faith in people's lives was something that came out of these portraits. And then this was all multiplied by the civil society revolution, with hundreds of thousands of NGOs emerging in the world, and an uneasy relationship between religious organizations and NGOs, because for some people, religion is just part of civil society, but if you actually looked at it that way, religious institutions would swamp the NGOs. So there is a complex relationship in the transformation that's taken place in civil society. These debt issues I mentioned came to a head around the year 2000, when the effort was to have an effort to address debt around the year 2000. More recently, the preoccupation with aid harmonization has put some of the issues of religion in the spotlight, because essentially there are so many actors involved in development now that it's often the problems of coordination have taken on an enormous importance. And just to give you a very simple picture of one African country and the AIDS programs, this is called spaghetti. But basically, what this has led to is many efforts at aid coordination. And this has presented the question of where and how do religious groups come into that. There are many alliances and partnerships on poverty that have emerged, some of them very positive. The World Parliament of Religions is focused on issues of development, and it's meeting next year in Salt Lake City. So hopefully it will again focus on these issues of poverty and development, as well as security and the environment. As there's been more focus on the weak states, the role of religion is an obvious issue, though it hasn't had very much attention. And where targets of health and education are concerned, clearly these service delivery, what Jim Kim, the head of the World Bank, calls the science of delivery, are missing a huge element when they don't take into account the religious actors. And the new focus on climate change also brings in many religious dimensions and has mobilized leaders. A lot of the people who met in New York last weekend, the hundreds of thousands who marched before the UN meeting, many of them came from religious groups and expressed their concerns in a religious light. So turning very quickly, I mentioned already some of the themes that have emerged from our work: the governance, the role of the state, the issue of ethics and corruption, governance issues, how are religious organizations involved or how are they not involved, tensions around various issues of human rights, the issue of proselytizing when it's linked to development, when it's perceived as a quid pro quo. In Cambodia, if you go to the church, you get free English lessons or computer lessons. That's what's the kind of issue that raises problems. The problems of coordination and the issues of gender that I mentioned before. I'm coming to the end, so prepare your questions, please. But just to give you an idea of things that are immediately in my inbox, in other words, in my email traffic today and yesterday. The first I mentioned before is the Ebola issue. How can we try to ensure that the billions of dollars that are going to be spent do involve a thoughtful approach to the role that religious institutions and leaders are playing and could play? Myanmar, where the religious tensions between Buddhists and Muslims have exploded and created a horrible obstacle, really, to the potential of that country to emerge. In Bangladesh, we're organizing an event that will discuss what's the meaning of a secular state as opposed to an Islamic state. It's a major issue there. In Senegal, we're working on family planning. In Nigeria, there is an interreligious effort to combat malaria initially, but extending now to child health and maternal health. In Kenya, we're very much focused right now on a study of orphanages and the changing role of orphanages in light of modern thinking and modern research on the damage that can be done to children who spend their lives in orphanages. We're dealing with questions of values in education. I'm involved in organizing the International Anti-Corruption Conference and trying to bring in religious voices. And the most fun thing I do has been the Fez Festival of Global Sacred Music, which was established after the first Gulf War, and which has as its idea that if people experience music from different cultures, that the emotional barriers among them will break down, and in a forum that we can have a different kind of dialogue. So on paths forward, you have to deal with each country. You need evidence. You need discernment and political antennae. I think all of us need to be willing to deal with the tough issues that are involved. There are tough issues around religious freedom. There are tough issues around gender. There are tough issues around issues like abortion and gay rights. All of those are issues where we probably need to find safe spaces where there can be a discussion of different perspectives on those issues, because they are, at the moment, major sources of tension. It's imperative to bring in more women into the religious discussions, and it can be done if you try and if you look. We need to focus on networks. We need more effort to make global events make sense, and interfaith work is an important approach that allows for objectivity. So I'm going to end with a quick story. I was in a country, which I will not name, with a minister of agriculture where the topic for a big meeting that was coming up was human rights. And this minister did not want to be with this woman, this American woman who was trying to tell him about human rights. So we had a 2-hour drive and a very difficult conversation. So he came from a desert country. So I started asking him about camels. And he knew every camel in the country by name. Camels were very important. He told stories about camels that kept us going for an hour. I asked him about cattle. He knew a little bit about cattle, about sheep. He wasn't very interested in goats and chickens. But then we came to a village, whereas in all villages there were donkeys everywhere that you could see, children riding on them. And so I said to him, well, what about donkeys? He said, we don't have any donkeys. So then I asked him, well, what are these creatures that I see around? And he said, they're not important. So this is my parable, that first of all, the first one is that something can be right in front of you and you don't see it. And clearly that's one of the lessons from religion, that the religious issues, the institutions, the leaders are there all the time. But there has been a blindness, an unwillingness to deal with them that is part of our problem. So we need religious literacy. We need to have much more attention to these issues. A second one is that what you see is often very much shaped by your frame of reference. So in this case, the minister didn't see village agriculture, the poverty, as anything to do with agriculture or his mission. It was not part of his vision of livestock or of poverty or development. And so because of his worldview, he simply didn't see. So I think the lesson from this is being conscious of what your worldview is and of how it shapes and influences the facts you draw from the enormous number of facts that we see and where it is that we're going. So the resources here, you can have this if you like, but let's open it up for questions.
Professor Marshall, really, thank you so much for joining us. Is this working? Yeah.
Yeah, just get close to it.
Great. So I'm very interested in the mechanics of how you do bring in additional women to plan interfaith events, or even just sensitize ministers in nations where women have not participated as much. What's the thought process? Is it statistical literacy? Is it a few case studies? I think we're sensitive to some of those issues here at BYU, and we're very sensitive to those issues in international development. And I teach business ethics and international development here, and then consult with the Women's Stats program. So we're trying to compare law with actual practice on 360 variables around the nation that affect the lives of women and girls. Thank you.
I'm sure I don't need to emphasize for this group here the really very powerful evidence that has come up about the importance of women's roles and engagement. Just to give you an example, when the level of education between a husband and wife is too great, even the benefits of the woman's education is not reflected. A woman's education is reflected in a child's head size because of better nutrition. So it's just a host of different information. I think there are two questions that you're asking, or at least that I perceive in this. The first one is how to engage women more actively in the whole thinking about development. And that's been a journey of about 35 or 40 years, and it's a continuing journey. And it's a dual journey of having more women involved in development issues and having in leadership positions, but also taking into account whether you're collecting data or whether you're planning your programs or strategies in development. And so there is now much more focus on what's now called GAD, gender and development. But I think that just to give you again an example, I went through 120 country briefs for an annual meeting of the World Bank a few years ago. And what I wanted to see was how often there was an issue of women's rights or women in any way in those briefs. And do you want to take a guess how many there were in 120 countries? 0. In other words, it was not a priority issue, and it had not been framed in action terms. The second issue comes to specifically engaging religious institutions and religious leaders, because in many traditions, you simply don't have women in leadership positions. And so if you invite people to the table, they're going to be men, and they're often not going to be youth. And one of the problems is a problem of perception, that means that the development people will take a look at that and say, well, you know, why should we listen to these people? Because they clearly have not absorbed the lesson of the importance of focusing on women. The way you deal with that is creatively, and you can always find women, because one of the other issues that's ironic is that women are the support of religious institutions. Their religiosity by most measures is higher. They keep institutions going within the family. It's women who pass on religious traditions. There are women's groups all over the place. So it's a question of dealing with the link between authority and the people who are really on the front line. And because in many cases, if you wanted to invite all the religious leaders involved, you'd have this room filled many times, even in a small country like Liberia. You have to use some judgment, and it's one of the first areas. I said the development community needs religious literacy. They need to have some understanding of how institutions work and why it's important and what the data shows and what the history is. But the religious communities need, I think, also to have more exposure to the kind of evidence that shows why the changing norms, which are fundamental changes in historic norms, are making a difference, and why countries that have been paid more attention to translating equal rights into reality have done better. So it's a question of knowledge and information and of creative effort.
I'm Tim Heaton. I teach sociology. I've been really interested in the rise of the prosperity gospel in Africa and Latin America. They seem to be very concerned about poverty and socioeconomic advancement, but their solution seems very antithetical to many development organizations. Their explanations for poverty and their statements about how you get out of poverty. How would you reconcile, if you were trying to work with a prosperity gospel organization and a development agency, how would you get them to come to terms with each other?
it can be difficult because some of the first let me clarify that my understanding when we're talking about prosperity gospels is essentially one of the most extraordinary developments of the 20th century, which is the rise of the charismatic traditions, whether it's Pentecostal or evangelical or whatever. And the Pew studies of this are extraordinary. There you have hundreds of millions of people who have been attracted to many of these charismatic traditions, and it's sweeping Latin America, sweeping Africa. There are various studies, and the conversation is not always easy because they tend to be very decentralized, often very fragmented, so they don't have a single voice, and they can be very hostile to the state. And because they're hostile to states, they can be very hostile to the World Bank or to foreigners, et cetera. So it's not an easy conversation. I remember in Guatemala, I had a very fiery pastor who yelled at me for 2 hours about how I was responsible for corruption. I mean, that was sort of a lesson. So it was not an easy conversation. I don't know. I think we made a little headway. The research is showing something very interesting, though, which is that there's a positive correlation between a lot of the charismatic traditions and development. And Peter Berger's comment is basically that Max Weber is alive and well in Guatemala, but also in South Africa. And by that he means that the kinds of traits that Martin Luther suggested among Protestants were responsible for the relative success of Protestant societies compared with Catholics apply also to some of the prosperity gospel churches, or basically the charismatic churches more broadly. There's more tendency to save, emphasis on hard work, and there also is less drinking. That's one. Women have often very attracted to the charismatic churches, partly because it makes their family life much easier. So that's sort of the bottom line. What worries people is that some of the prosperity gospels are associated with very corrupt religious leaders. So enormous amounts of money being siphoned off from people who don't have very much money, and also it seems antithetical to a lot of basic religious values, but an emphasis on greed and on basically on getting rich, which sits uneasily with a lot of others. And third concern is that there is, in some cases, a lot of violence associated, not in many, but in some cases. Guatemala that I know of, there actually are death threats and so on that are associated with tension between Catholics and some of the Pentecostals. So it's a phenomenon which may be a positive one in the developmental sense, and some of the churches are doing very good work, but there clearly are elements that are worrying.
My name is Melissa Tingy. I'm a psychology major, and forgive me if you already went over this in your presentation. I was a bit late, but I was curious how you define religion and if the rising role of atheism is also considered, or the other non-traditional forms of religion.
I skipped that part of the discussion, but it is something that is important, that when you introduce a subject like this, what is it that we're talking about? And we could spend about 5 hours talking about definitions of religion. Just to give you one element of it, though, we have tended to use the word faiths, in part because the Vedic traditions, in other words, Hindu, Buddhist, etc., are often uncomfortable with some of the implication they see in religion, which is that religion comes from the Latin word to bind. It's basically an institutional link. And they don't have that concept in the ways that they practice their faith. But then I was at the UN, and I was using the word faith, and a Buddhist woman stood up and said, "We don't have faith because we don't believe in God, so please don't use that word." So one of my conclusions is you can't win. one of the more tricky things, and this relates a little bit to your specific question on atheism, is that a lot of people prefer to use the word spiritual. But again, what does spiritual mean? Is spiritual the essence of religion? In other words, the good, really the element of the soul, or is spiritual in opposition to religion? In other words, without the institutional apparatus that goes with organized religious traditions. And the word is used in both ways. So I don't have an easy answer to that. There is, in interfaith work, clearly one of the ideals is to be inclusive. So when I remember once I got out of the elevator at one of the big parliament of the world's religions, and there was a very loud noise coming from someplace, and there was a sign that said pagan party. So, so many of the interreligious meetings are very inclusive in the sense of having indigenous traditions, pagan, and people who are humanists, or a lot of atheists are not terribly interested in participating, though there's some intellectuals who do. I think that the bottom line is to be careful, and I should have said something about definitions. I just didn't get to it. But it's a fiercely difficult issue on which many books have been written, and the main thing for me is to be conscious of how the people you're talking to are defining and seeing an issue. It's a bit your donkeys and camels example of how is it that they view it.
I talk really loud. Can everybody just hear me from here? My name is Diane Monson. I'm wondering how the tradition of missionaries that go into countries that want to develop or perhaps need development and stay. The Christian tradition, particularly, of sending missionaries to go live their lives in a country. You mentioned the briefcase NGOs. They come in, they go out, and it seems to me that's a big reason they fail. They don't really connect with the local people, and they don't build any trust. And so our religious institutions, do you think, in a unique position in that they can call upon members to go and stay somewhere and become one of the people and live from the perspective of the people, but also bring something and do it without that the empire, the threat of empire, like we're really secretly coming to impose our empire on you, but basically do it with the hope of we're coming humbly to live among you, to learn from you, to become one with you, and share with you some of the things that we know that can help you. I'm just thinking religious institutions might be better positioned than NGOs to actually make a difference that's lasting.
Well, clearly that is the view of many religious actors, that they are more authentic. They have the genuine interests of the poor and of the people much more in mind than what they see as more mercenary, whether it's business or governments, which are very distrusted. There's also a very interesting study, which has been actually quite controversial, to publish by a guy called Robert Woodbury. And he's run huge statistical correlations and basically finds a very large correlation between missionary work in all parts of the world, but especially Africa, and success in democracy and success in development. And frankly, to me, it's a no-brainer that a lot of the missionaries were courageous. They came, they worked against incredible odds. I mean, look at Albert Schweitzer, and, so many stories of heroic people. We also know that they did a lot of bad things, and they left behind some very serious scars as well. But I think it's a part of history, the period of missionaries. Now, one of the negative images is something that Desmond Tutu says. I've heard him say it a couple of times, which is when the missionaries came, we had the land and they had the Bible. And they said, close your eyes, let us pray. And when we opened our eyes, they had the land and we had the Bible. And what that suggests is that they had really religion in Africa, Christianity in Africa is very, very African. And it's got all kinds of African dynamism and spirit. In some sense, the sort of missionary era in Africa is behind us a long time ago. And it has resulted in one of the great social revolutions of the 20th century, which is the extraordinary transformation of the religious profile of Africa. That's gone from a tiny group of Christians and not that many Muslims to hundreds of millions, the most dynamic religious area in the world. So I think your question is a very good one, but the answer is a very complicated one.
Maybe we can just take a moment here and pause. Those of you who aren't going to stay till 5:30 would like to not excuse you, but to thank the public's interest, and then if everybody else wants to either come closer or stay where they are, we'll plan to entertain Q&A for as long as you're interested, or until 5:30, whichever comes first. I might just interpose a thought here. Two quick ones. The Berkley Center, the World Face Development Dialogue, has for several years, with support from the Luce Foundation, and I'll put it this way, been trying to map the work in development that is being done by faith-based organizations around the world. It's a tremendous undertaking, and they've taken functional and geographical approaches trying to define this. It might be interesting just to hear some of the results of that effort. Kind of on the opposite end of thinking globally, there was a bunch of high school kids in Rome in the 1960s who decided they wanted to do good. The result is a very interesting organization that Professor Marshall is very involved with, the San Egidio community, which is a lay community, part of the Catholic Church, which in the past, I guess it's now almost 50 years, right, has done, among other things, bring the civil war in Mozambique to a close, and is running perhaps one of the most important interfaith dialogue gatherings that happens each year. I tease you with that kind of a thought because there are things that happen because people decide they want to do good, which is really quite significant. We had a course we taught a few months ago about religion and world affairs that talked a little bit about, isn't it interesting, sometimes, kind of like the last question, for those of us who have been on missions, LDS returned missionaries, it's hard to envision an interaction with somebody that involves religion that doesn't have evangelization at its core as the ultimate objective. But the idea of the gospel was also restored so that good could expand on the earth. That's not a bad objective. It's a pretty strong premise. But it does challenge you along the lines that Professor Marshall was talking about, to think in other terms. What can I do that just, there are some days that the missionaries in Thailand, they'll take off the badges and they'll leave in the apartment, and they go out to do good for the sake just of doing good without any identification. I'm not saying it's an easy choice, and I love the fact that there is a little bit of tension there. That the tension is good. It usually leads to some kind of next step and some energy. With those thoughts, we'd like to just ask you again to come forward with additional questions, and we'll take the dialogue for another 20 to 25 minutes. Professor Marshall, I'll leave that to you to run. Okay. And basically, you have to ask a question.
Okay, well, do you want to start?
Hello, my name is Macy Byer. I'm a senior studying sociology and international development. I'm very interested in both of the questions that Professor Oxelgaard brought up, but in addition to that, I would love to know more about how and what the reaction is, I guess, among these communities with religions that do focus on proselytizing. Is that encouraged, or where's the line in doing development work and doing faith work, if that makes sense. So how are those combined, and when do you make sure that they're separate?
It's a complicated and an interesting question. And my first answer, which is not just ducking it, is that it really does vary tremendously by country, and the sensitivities and the issues vary. I also make a different distinction, which is that to me, the link between proselytizing or evangelizing in connection with a development program is rather different from the freedom of religion within a society. I know I have had discussions of the latter, in other words, of the sort of general, what would be described here as freedom of religion. The main argument that I get back is that in societies that are fractured, number one, or that are trying to establish a national identity which has an element of the religious tradition of that country, there is a tendency to see people trying to convert away from that religion, whether it's Buddhism or Hinduism, as a threat to the stability of the society. So that what you will hear is people making a distinction between a situation where you're allowing people freedom to practice their faith from what are seen as active efforts to encourage people to change their religion. But those are not the issues that I work on. The issues that I work on, and again, I'm going to give you two categories, is humanitarian relief. And there is in international law, but also I think in most people's understandings of ethics, that when people are facing a volcano or a hurricane and they're desperate or they're refugees in a camp, that it is basically immoral to link or to condition in any way the assistance that you provide to people to either their belief, in other words, that they belong to a certain tradition, or to encouraging them to change their beliefs. And so this is something that I would say 98% of the people who work on humanitarian programs would agree with that in the situations of desperation, that you simply must do good for the sake of helping people. And no matter how much you think that they're missing a spiritual part of their life, you need to leave it aside. Now that, it isn't 100%. The 2% would argue that you can't separate it. The spiritual welfare and the hunger are linked, that you simply, it's artificial to divide them. And for example, in Haiti, I know there were people, and these include people like Brahma Kumaris, I mean, people who are more in the Hindu sort of meditative faiths, who said that it was as important to provide spiritual help. Not necessarily, they wouldn't describe it as conversion, but engagement, as it was to help people after the Haiti earthquake. So that it's a little bit complicated, but not very complicated. In other words, there's a pretty clear line where humanitarian is concerned. The issue has not been dealt with thoroughly or carefully on the development side, which is much bigger and much more varied and much more complicated. In general, most people would agree that quid pro quo is a bad thing. In other words, if you say you're not allowed to come and study English unless you go to church on Sunday, that is out of bounds. In Cambodia, we have seen people coming, frankly, from Korean churches, really giving people a $100 bill to come to church because there are targets and quotas. And I'll tell you another story. We were at a meeting in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, a few years ago, and somebody from Sri Lanka pulled out a book and slammed it onto the table and said, this is a World Vision person who has written this book, and it was an extraordinary sociological study of Buddhist communities all over Asia. But on every page, it had a chart, a little graph in the bottom of the percentage that had found Jesus and the percentage who had heard the message. For him, this was a demonstration that all the serious effort to understand the Buddhist culture was designed only to prepare for conversion. And he described this as against the law, but also a terrible thing. So that's the kind of attitude that you see. Where I see the complexities is less in health, because it's clear a doctor is a doctor, and there are very few who would say you can't come to this hospital, we won't treat you unless you belong to X tradition. In other words, the health issues are pretty easy. Education is much more complicated, because one of the big issues in education globally is quality, but it is also values. In other words, what are the values that an education curriculum is teaching? And there, one of the things we try to do is clearly people talk about civic education, but it's often not very well defined. It's something we really need to think about more. But to encourage, and this is in the United States too, education about religion, so that people have an understanding rather than education for religion. In other words, sort of Sunday school type education that really is designed to prepare people to be members of a specific community. And these issues obviously become much more complicated when you have a diversity of people or when you have a threatened minority. So there are rules, for example, that many development projects that if you're going to have meetings in a religious facility, they have to be separated by a certain number of hours, or that you can't construct a church or a mosque with religious funds. And some of them seem very artificial, but I think that what we need, and this is what I want to do in the Berkley Center, is to review the various codes of conduct that exist, and then to try to identify and to have a thoughtful dialogue about where the issues are. In other words, where are the lines? Now, I know that the Catholic Church, but also the Church of Latter-day Saints, makes a conscious effort to separate missionary activity from charitable activity. In Cambodia, I know I was told that it's in different parts of the country, that you would not operate the two in different parts of the country. I would imagine because of the sensitivities that are there. One of the comments that people gave me in Cambodia is that some people had knocked on the wrong doors, and I think that they were some of the missionaries from your church who were being accused of knocking insensitively on some powerful official's door and therefore creating a certain amount of havoc. But there's no question that the Latter-day Charities was doing wonderful work with neonatal resuscitation and totally admirable work, which was not in any way the quid pro quo category. So it varies. And as I said, the person from Sri Lanka is a place where it's extremely sensitive. In India, a lot of sensitivity around the issue. Cambodia, a lot of sensitivity. Africa, not so much. Africa is pretty, and in Latin America, where you can, as someone was saying, the Catholic Church also sees a clear separation. She said, for the Buddhists, the idea that you would give up one tradition if you join another is bizarre. They just don't understand it. So this idea of conversion is something they don't get. And so they are not hesitant to go to the church if they get $100, but it doesn't really mean that they've in any way given up the sense of their culture or of their tradition. So it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly.
Hi, my name is Emily Wolf. I'm a student studying public relations with minors in nonprofit management and women's studies. And you talked about the value and the importance of religious literacy. And I wanted to ask your thoughts on the best approaches to attaining religious literacy, both personally and on a widespread level, because within every faith there is such a spectrum of belief and practice. And then, with every individual, there's a certain amount of openness or closed-mindedness when it comes to learning about other beliefs. And so I'm just curious on your thoughts.
Well, it's a question that's exercising me a lot right now, because we've talked a lot about religious literacy, and in some sense we have to take it the next step and suggest what it would actually involve. But the first comment, I don't know how many of you have seen the book about religious literacy by Stephen Prothero, who's a professor, but the basic message of that is that there's an extraordinary decline in the United States in understanding about even the tradition in which you were raised. Ironically, people who are more religious, in the sense of going to church more often or being more part of communities, may have lost even more literacy than the general population. So there is a general concern that there's an erosion of basic knowledge within the American population in general, and it's a problem. And it's accentuated in the public school system, where there's a lot of sensitivity about talking about religion. Somebody may get sued if the teacher talks about certain religious aspects. So I think there's a real need to sort of sort it out and to appreciate that some basic knowledge in K to 12 as well as in universities is very important. Now, the kind of religious literacy that we're talking about, and I also talk about development literacy, is hard to define. And to me, it is the easiest way to start in many ways is through the institutional side. In other words, very practical. So let's not try to explain, what your view of heaven and hell and resurrection, or if you're going to be reincarnated and what does that mean, and so forth, that those things. So sort of first, how would you find out a basic sort of religious profile, a mapping of an area where you're working? How would you learn who the leaders are and who the informal leaders are, the women? How does power work? How is it engaged with political parties? In other words, very practical issues. How is it organized for charity? How does the charitable giving or charitable work, how is it organized? What's the attitude towards favored populations, etc. I think also conveying some of the beauty, sort of music and art and stories can often be a very important way to introduce people to different faith traditions. Some of the statistics and the evidence suggests that the best way to learn about another tradition is to know somebody. A lot of the data on favorable and negative attitudes towards Islam in the United States conclude that people who've known a Muslim or several Muslims are more likely to have an informed and generally more positive attitude towards Muslims than people who've never met a Muslim. And the same would be true with Jewish and probably Mormon as well. So this question of finding ways that people can meet each other is important. A lot of discussion about interfaith, which is essentially finding ways that people can get to know each other. Actually, just to give you another sort of aside, in Cambodia, they were talking about doing some training about religion, and one of the things that surprised me is that there's a fear of dealing with other religions, a fear of embarrassment, fear of making a mistake. So one of the things that was included in some of the introductions that people had to interfaith work was very practically, do you need to wear a hat when you go into a church, or do you sit down, or when do you sit down, what do you have to do? In other words, very, very practical things about how another tradition. Now, in schools, you'll often see the people focus on the food and on holidays and celebrations, and that's at least one way into it at the younger levels. At a certain point, clearly you need to get involved in a more serious way in really asking what are very, very difficult questions, which is how and in what ways do religious practices really influence the way people live and the choices they make every day within their private lives and their family, as well as in the public space. We've done a very interesting case study of an issue that's a horrible issue, but one which is often attributed to religion, which is female genital cutting. And the issue, we're talking about 120 million girls who've had this practice, and it's often attributed to religion, interestingly, because a lot of the countries which have very high rates are Muslim, but there also are a lot of Christian communities that practice it. So the question is it religion or is it culture? Is it mistaken beliefs? And so that's the first part of the case study, is trying to sort that out. And then the second is, what do you do about it? Because when you go into a society and tell people to change their ways because they're breaching human rights, you get a negative reaction. So that's been a shock to many feminists around the world it's a horrible practice, and it has no benefits whatsoever. But there are a few things that are interesting to remember. One is that it was done in the United States and England in the 19th century as a cure for nymphomania and various other in other words, it was not uncommon. So it's not some primitive practice. It's one that's in our own cultures. There are many religious leaders, Christian and Muslim, who've issued fatwas and condemned it. So it's very easy to say it's not about religion, but if the local imam says it's about religion, and if a woman says, I do it because it's the only way I do it to my daughter because that's the way I show that I am following my religious traditions in my community, it's obviously religious. So it's an illustration of how complicated these questions are, and how if you're going to try to bring change, and we do want to bring change, we do believe in human rights, we do believe that harming children is not a good thing to do, we need to try to get more into the skin of how people are thinking and how they're reflecting, and how far it's a practice that's comes out of men who are trying to control their wives or the marriageability of daughters and all these other issues, or is it really about religion? So the case study is online if anyone's interested, and it's a difficult one for all of us to deal with because of the pain of the issue. But
Is this a case study you did?
yeah, it's on the Berkley Center website, and if we can figure out how to get anybody who's interested the links.
My name is Mary Ellen Spencer, and I'm studying public health with a minor in international development. And you've definitely touched on this already, but I just wanted to know personally in your work, when you're preparing to meet with people from lots of different religions and countries, how you are religiously sensitive and how you prep yourself to, not make mistakes. And when tension does rise, what's the best way to kind of calm things down from your experience? Thank you.
Well, I guess the first thing is a little bit obvious, that when you're in certain situations, you try to dress in an appropriate way. So, I'll wear a headscarf in some situations and make sure my arms and legs are covered, even though I'm not sure that they're really going to do any damage. But in any event, you try to be respectful to the situation you're in. The place I was most uncomfortable with that was in Saudi Arabia, because you have to wear an abaya. And I was sitting in, a restaurant, and somebody says you have to get out because you're a woman. Those kinds of things are a little bit uncomfortable. But beyond that, the sort of basic respect and not going overboard, not exaggerating, but really trying to have some understanding of the people that you're meeting with. I think there are two other lessons. One is learn as much about the people that you're meeting as you can, whether it's Google or asking people if you know about their children, if you know about their lives, if you know what they're interested in, if they're interested in fishing, if you can find some way of learning about an individual and of the nature of the group and their history, and ask them about it, because people do love to talk, and that's that. And then the second is to listen, and to listen very carefully. Now, when there's tension, that's another question, and that depends on the role you're playing. If you're chairing a meeting and all of a sudden people are getting ready to fight, you clearly have to do something. If what people are saying is ad hominem, personally insulting, then it's important to intervene and to say, look, let's keep the personalities out of it. So it can be difficult, and it doesn't happen very often, because actually one of the problems with interfaith dialogue and interfaith work is that it tends to be the converted who come to the table. And that's one of the critiques of a lot of interfaith dialogue and work, is that the people that you need to reach are not coming to these events and these meetings, and you need to reach them. And so one of the things a lot of us, including myself, are struggling with is how do we reach them? And that raises the ethical issue of who you talk to, and how far do you talk to people with whom you disagree profoundly? And how far do you try to go through intermediaries? In fact, that's sort of the easiest technique, is you talk to a person who knows the person who holds beliefs you don't believe in. And you try to find, the other thing that I believe very much in is safe space. In other words, you try to find places to have difficult discussions where you don't have the press there, and where people are not going to be, every word they say is not going to be quoted afterwards. So Chatham House rules, that kind of thing. And there are some very interesting efforts. I forget what it's called. There's a woman in Boston who runs an effort which has done a lot of work bringing together people on issues even like abortion, and finding ways to allow people to see each other as human beings, and then at least to finding some areas. So I have a couple of examples of dealing with very, very difficult people and cases, and one approach is to try to find, is there some common ground? Is there some place where we can agree, at least to start? And then the idea is that if you have a conversation and you get to know somebody, then there's a possibility that you can see that maybe there are elements and positions on both sides. There's an allergy in a lot of organizations, including a place like the World Bank. People get very uneasy when you talk about dialogue, because they think dialogue is just talk, not action, blah, blah, etc. But as Winston Churchill said, what is it? Jaw's better than war. The interesting thing, within religious traditions, it took me a while to understand this, that dialogue is an openness to transformation. Dialogue is not debate. It's not discussion. Dialogue, if you're engaged in a real dialogue, you really have to be open to reassessing your own views and to rethinking positions, and that's not comfortable. But I think it's very important to trying to get beyond the stale positions that we too often find ourselves in.
Let me just, she mentioned the website. It is really one of the best websites I've ever found for any reason, whatever. I think in particular on Cambodia, is that right? I mean, there are dozens, if not actually hundreds, of interviews down there about different aspects of faith and development, different projects. It's an extraordinarily rich portal, so to speak, onto this world. Again, if you'll join me in thanking Professor Marshall for joining us today.
Well, thank you.